Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
Good morning again, and welcome to In the Word. We are pursuing a whole quarter's work on the call of God, the urgent call of God seen in the Old Testament, and we moved into the book of Acts to see how it worked within the very early church. And last week we saw the call of the seven. We call them deacons, anyway, they were assistants in the specific work of helping the apostles with a real, very early problem in the church. Today we're going to see a completely different kind of call for a particular person to go and preach the gospel to somebody who's a foreigner. So here we go on a new line of development, Lee, a call to break down barriers.
Yes, this fellow Philip is a real model. You know, we talk about Peter being the first one to kind of bridge over into Gentile evangelism with the story of Cornelius, which we'll be discussing in a couple of weeks here. And there's no doubt about it, the story of Cornelius is a pivotal moment in the book of Acts. But in a way, Philip was really the one to break through that barrier first with his ministry to the Samaritans and to this Ethiopian man.
Let me tell you a story. I was in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. I was just outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and there was a gentleman standing there in a robe, and obviously he was some religious person, you know. And I walked up to him and said hello. He spoke English. And I found out that he was an Ethiopian monk. Engaged him in conversation and asked him, what is the tradition of your discipline in Christianity? He turned to me and smiled and asked me if I had ever heard of the Ethiopian eunuch. And I said, oh yes, and smiled back at him. And so we had a jolly conversation.
Yeah. Now, to bridge from last week to this, we met the seven who were nominated by the congregation and approved by the apostles, the 12, to engage in this wonderful financial ministry of collecting donations and then distributing them to the needy. And two of the seven that we met there, we learned more about. The first was Stephen. We learn in chapter 6 about his ministry in the synagogue of the freedmen there in Jerusalem.
Yes.
About his arrest, his lengthy trial in chapter 7.
Isn't his defense the longest speech?
It is. It's the longest speech in the book of Acts, yeah. It takes almost the whole chapter 7. And then that ends with his stoning. So we learn that these seven who were appointed to the financial ministry of the church in Jerusalem also took every opportunity to minister in other ways, including preaching and teaching.
Yeah, their specific labor did not keep them from being evangelists.
Exactly.
Obviously.
And then the very beginning of chapter 8 is an important transition. That's where we learn that Stephen, who was stoned to death, was buried by his fellow Christians, and that led to a new wave of persecution that caused many of the Christians to scatter outside of Jerusalem to
That's
flee.
A good comment, and I've often heard it preached in sermons when I was younger, that the Lord had in mind all the time world evangelism, but as long as the church was comfortable in Jerusalem, there wasn't much motivation or pressure on them to get out into the rest of the world. And so actually, the persecution that Saul was involved with, who became Paul the Apostle, was involved in, really was in a way worked to the goals that the Father had for the church in the first place.
I mean, we have to take seriously the suffering that comes to Christians from persecution, and not, say, oh well, what's the big deal? It's God's will or something like that. So we take the suffering seriously, but you're right. It is a wonderful thing how persecution is sometimes the seedbed of a great wave of evangelism.
Yes.
Something like that is happening right today in northern India, where where Christians are being persecuted more fiercely than they have for a very long time.
Yes.
And it has led and is leading to a great wave of commitment and outreach among those Christians who are being,
isn't this strange?
Who are being persecuted.
It's strange.
Yeah, it is. So there's scattering, but as we see with Philip, there's a renewed commitment to evangelism as a result of the persecution following Stephen's death. Now, the rest of chapter 8 tells us about Philip's ministry outside of Jerusalem and his evangelistic ministry.
Mainly in two areas.
Yeah.
Samaria. Say something about Samaria. What was it like? Was this just a very simple thing to go to Samaria, like we would go from here to Jonesboro or something like that?
It's just a few miles away, like going to Jonesboro. But in other ways, it's a world away, because the Samaritans, as you mentioned in a recent lesson, were the result of an intermarriage of Israelites left behind after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, and their intermarriage with other people groups who had been forcibly moved in to live in that area as part of the imperial strategy of
many centuries before
the Assyrian. And so what we have is a mixed race of people there with Jewish base, and they still worshiped Yahweh.
Well, I remember Jesus and the woman of Samaria who they got into a conversation. You Jews worship in Jerusalem. We Samaritans worship here on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, where there was and there's still a Samaritan group in that same place.
Community worship. Notice there that in Jesus' conversation with the Ethiopian woman, the question wasn't who they worshiped. They worshiped the same God. It was just where they worshiped, Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim.
Yeah, right.
At any rate, there had been centuries of hostility, as most of our viewers know, between Samaritans and Jews. And the hostility was fanned by both sides. There was mistreatment both ways.
And we get the famous Good Samaritan story in the Gospel of Luke.
So in Jesus' ministry, we see him reaching out to Samaritans, and now we see Philip kind of emulating that. He reached out, but that is a huge reach into a different...
As you say, it's a completely different world, even though it was just 20, 30 miles away.
Right. But now we come to the story of Philip's ministry to an Ethiopian man. So he's taken the gospel north into Samaria, and now he's taking it southward toward Africa.
By the way, I remember one very small statement made in passing in the book of Acts, that the gospel even went beyond Samaria into Galilee. We don't know a whole lot about that, but it's obviously on the move, the preaching of the gospel through Samaria back into Galilee.
There's so much evangelism going on at this period of time that Luke does not tell us about. We know that as they scattered out. We know that because later Christians arrive at places where there are already Christians.
How did they get there?
When Paul got to Damascus, there were already Christians. When Paul
that's why he went there in the first place.
Right, to arrest the Christians. But how did those Christians get in Damascus? We can talk about that next week, maybe.
Okay, let me read the text, because we do have some things to explain here. Beginning in chapter 8, verse 26. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of Kandake, which means Queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, "Go to that chariot and stay near it." Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. "Do you understand what you're reading?" Philip asked. "How can I," he said, "unless someone explains it to me?" So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now this is the passage of Scripture the eunuch was reading. Quote, "He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth." End of quote. The eunuch asked Philip, "Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about? Himself or someone else?" Philip began with that very passage of Scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here's water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. And the next verse says that Philip was found in Azotus, which is now is actually the city of Ashdod.
And Philip continued his ministry on up to Caesarea, the Roman capital of the region.
Yes.
And seems to have settled there and raised his family.
Now, there are a few. Why don't we go back to the beginning and just work our way quickly through the text?
Good.
Because there's some really significant questions to be answered, and there are also, I think, some significant observations to be made that are good for us today.
Good.
Starting out,
we have a messenger of the Lord.
Yes.
Comes to Philip and gives him geographical instructions to go south. That would be south from Samaria and south from Jerusalem. Gaza is down in the old Philistine territory.
Yeah, as was Ashdod.
Down along the coast, the southwestern
coast
part of
well, we know where
Palestine.
The Gaza Strip is now.
That's right.
And part of the Gaza Strip is, is outside of the Israeli territory, and part of what would be called the Gaza Strip is in the territory of Israel. So it's contested.
And this southern road
now,
would have led down into Egypt and then on south into
very close to
Africa.
the coast. Yeah, that's the coastal route.
So that would have been the way to get home, for him to get home to Ethiopia.
Now this statement, an important official, suggests that this is a person really at the highest levels of government.
It's a word that means a very powerful man.
Yeah. Comes from the word for power.
Yeah, so it means that he's a high-ranking government official.
Now, who is this queen? Well, in the NIV, we have this word Kandake, and in the King James, we have Candace. And when you hear Candace, you're likely to think that was her name, but that's not her name.
It's a title.
Yeah.
It's a title. It's like saying
Pharaoh,
Caesar.
Caesar is a title.
Caesar title, yeah. It's
well,
like
now, there's even a suggestion as to which queen of Egypt we're talking about.
Ethiopia.
In Ethiopia. Amenteteri has been suggested. We do know the names of a sequence of queens. I don't know who found this out, but I was able to find this, and she was from 25 AD 25 to 41. That fits the category.
That's about when we are
about
here.
The time, yeah.
We didn't mention what role he has in the Ethiopian government. He's the Secretary of the Treasury, and that's a very, very high ranking.
You don't get higher than that.
Yeah, so he's very important.
Unless you're just the ruler, you know.
And perhaps we should mention the word eunuch. In ancient times, men were castrated so that they could serve either as the guards of a king's harem,
yes,
his wives and concubines,
yes,
or so they could safely serve a queen.
Yeah, they could be around women.
Yeah, right.
Safely.
Yeah, I will go on to mention the fact that this was so common for a man to be in the government or in the service of a queen, to be castrated, to be a eunuch, that the word eunuch sometimes came just to mean servant of a queen, regardless of his sexual condition. Yeah. So we don't really know which it is, but that's not the most important thing about him.
This man, it seems to be a non-Jew.
He's called an Ethiopian, and I think that is that states his race. Mm-hmm. He's not Jewish ethnically; he's Ethiopian ethnically.
But we know that there were many people who were not Jewish, but who were lovers of the Jewish religion.
Yeah,
and who were sometimes swarming toward becoming proselytes.
Right. And you bring this up because the end of verse 27 tells us that the man had traveled all the way from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to worship. He's not there on government business. He's there on personal, spiritual business.
Well, in East Tennessee, we say that he came for a peace.
Yes, he did, but for a very specific reason.
To worship.
If he is an ethnic Ethiopian, what's he doing there? Worshiping, and you've answered that for us.
The Jewish religion, and you might say theology or philosophy, with its monotheism and high ethical standards, really became very attractive, to many non-Jewish people.
Yeah. So some became full converts. We call them proselytes. And others were just deeply attracted to Judaism and associated with Judaism without becoming a full convert, and we sometimes call them God-fearers.
And that's the term that the Scripture itself uses.
Right.
Okay,
now, when it says that he's traveling in a chariot, notice that he's sitting. And I think chariot gives us the wrong impression. I can remember old Sunday school literature that has him standing in what looks like a Ben-Hur style war chariot with Charlton Heston standing in it or something like that.
You know what comes to mind?
What?
Going to church in a buggy.
Oh.
But I think this was really high
a really
styles.
Fancy buggy.
It was the Cadillac of buggies.
Yeah, I think it's a carriage. I think that would be the best word. It probably has horses drawing it. There may even have been a servant driving it.
Yeah.
And he's sitting in this thing. He's not standing in a war chair.
And there's room for others.
There is, yes, so as we're about to see.
Yeah.
Now he's wealthy enough that he can actually purchase a scroll of Isaiah. That would have been rare for an individual to own, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and he's reading.
Yeah, he can read.
So Philip says, you're reading it, do you understand it? And the man says, how can I unless someone guides me, I think.
The word means guide. The word explains means guide, and that's a beautiful word. Because guide implies more than just explain the meaning of the words. It means guide him into an appropriate response to what he's reading.
Yeah, deep understanding of and appreciation for and doing something about it. Now the quote is from Isaiah chapter 53, one of the last suffering servant poems, and verses 7 and 8.
And it emphasizes the death of Jesus, which of course is the centerpiece of the gospel, the good news, the death and resurrection.
Well, it starts with death, slaughter, and ends with death.
His life was taken.
Now, then we have what do we have in the middle?
In between, we learn about the nature of his death. We learn that he faced it silently, without complaint. We learn that
almost willingly.
yes, yes, voluntarily. That's the point in Hebrews. We learn that it was a humiliating death, and it was.
Yes.
And we learn that it was an unjust death. He
Right.
he was not deserving of it. So
Well,
that's
the critical point in the last servant poem. He didn't do anything
right.
that he should die for, but others have, and he's taking their place.
Yeah. The earnestness of this Ethiopian man is so interesting. In verse 31, where it says he invited Philip to come up and sit with him, the word is actually begged. He begged him to come up and sit. And then in verse 34, tell me, please. I really just want to know. That earnestness
Well,
is
the
beautiful.
old King James has a way of saying it. I pray thee.
Yeah, I pray thee. And this is a very wise question. Who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?
Well, you know, they're still asking the same question.
In the servant songs of Isaiah. Yeah.
Who is the servant?
Who is this servant? Is it the prophet? Is it a coming
Is it
Messiah?
the nation?
Yeah.
Who is it?
Yeah.
And of course, we Christians take it to be a foreshadowing and foretelling of Jesus and his suffering.
Philip took advantage of his curiosity and started telling him the good news about Jesus.
Right.
He's preaching the gospel to him.
Well, now I think verse 35 is a very suggestive statement. Began with this passage, but implies went further to other scripture from the Old Testament.
The next paragraph describes the baptism, and it's the Ethiopian man who initiates this conversation about baptism. And some people ask, well, how does he even know about baptism? And the point you're making is that what we have printed in our text here, what's written in the book of Acts, is just the tip of the iceberg of what Philip would have actually taught the man as they're riding along in the carriage.
Well, when you look at Acts chapter 2, where the gospel message was first spoken, you see a progression. The sermon focuses on Christ, who he was, what happened to him, why it happened to him, and the injustice of it all. And then the crowd asks, what should we do about this?
Right.
Then what are the next words out of Peter's mouth?
Repent and be baptized, every one of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure a very similar communication took place here between verse 35 and verse 36, where
wouldn't you think that the person reading this in the book of Acts has already read what went before it, and immediately identifies?
Would assume that.
Right.
So I'm sure Philip went on from this quote about the death of Jesus and would have discussed his resurrection and then the appropriate way to respond to the good news.
Right. Now,
Verse 30.
Many of our viewers are using the King James text of the Bible for their lesson. Some are using the NIV, and we have read the NIV.
Right.
And obviously something is left out
Verse 30,
when we read it.
Verse 37 is just totally omitted from the NIV.
Why?
The King James was a translation, a brilliant translation, based on manuscripts that come a little later. And after 1611, when the King James translation was made, many of the oldest and very finest and most accurate manuscripts of the New Testament have been discovered since then. And what we discovered is that the earliest manuscripts of the book of Acts do not have verse 37 in there at all.
Okay.
It starts appearing in manuscripts and in translations upper in the 500s, so hundreds of years later. And so in
other words, what you're saying is that no manuscript before the 500 years has it.
Correct, correct.
And so that's why
we
modern
assume
translations leave it.
Modern translations leave it out. Yeah. And so the verse 38 goes on to describe Philip's baptism as they went down into the water. By the way, some people wonder how there could be enough water to baptize if they're on a desert road. But the word desert means deserted, not Sahara. Not the Sahara Desert.
And they are near the coast, and there were, this was a major route.
Yeah.
And there would be cisterns and other ways of supplying water.
Like that,
yes.
Yeah. The story ends in such a beautiful way with Philip being taken off by the Spirit for further ministry, but the Ethiopian man went on his way rejoicing. Yeah, what a beautiful ending.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Now, you had a beautiful way of looking at this story and applying it. Before we turn the cameras on, why don't you take the remaining time that we have and talk about what we learn about how to approach people with the gospel, what we can learn from this story.
I think Philip is one of the finest models of evangelistic strategy, personal evangelism, and maybe even congregational evangelism that we have. The first thing I notice is that he was obedient to the call of God. When the messenger of God said, "Go and meet this man," he went. He didn't say, "An Ethiopian man? He's an African. He's a different race. I'm not interested in him."
The church is for the Jews.
Yeah, he didn't do that. He was obedient to the call of God to reach with the gospel across racial and ethnic barriers.
And that's the point of our lesson.
It is, yes, and it's a main point. But there's more than that. He also has an eagerness. He wants to do this. He's not doing it just because the Spirit tells him to. He runs up. We just
I like your translation. He glued himself to the church.
He ran up and glued himself. That's literally what it says. And then another thing, he begins by listening. He didn't just come right up to the chariot and say, "Oh, stop all that reading of the Old Testament. Let me tell you about Jesus." He listens to him where he's reading from the Old Testament and says, "Let's talk about that." And he leads him to Jesus from where he is. That's such a brilliant strategy.
I think it's interesting. The eunuch has been in Jerusalem, but he doesn't seem to know anything about the Christian movement.
He does not.
He really doesn't know anything about Jesus, apparently.
Apparently, he doesn't. This beginning where he was is so important. And then finally, in his evangelism, he doesn't major in the minors. He puts the focus on Jesus, which is where it needs to be. We're not converting people to this moral stance or this doctrine. We're calling people to Jesus.
Every example of a gospel sermon in the book of Acts does the same thing. The gospel message is Jesus.
Yes.
Nothing else.
Wherever it starts, its goal is Jesus. And
right.
Good. That's a great model.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, we're so glad you could be with us today, and this lesson is so full of good news and promise for the future, and we know that the gospel is going to go into Africa, deep into Africa, and all over the world of that day. And we're so happy about your being with us, and we hope you'll come back and be with us as we continue on these things, the call of God as seen in the early church in the book of Acts. God's blessings be with you this week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.